It seems that COVID is now so mild that it's actually being outcompeted ecologically with common endemic pathogens like influenza, RSV, respiratory syncytial virus, and other standard pathogens that increase during the cold and flu season. Now, we're going to talk about this viral interference or pathogen interference. I came across a few different articles, and I've been reaching out to some emergency room physicians that I'm personally friends with and talking to them about what are they seeing in the actual hospital setting, because we're hearing a lot of rumors about bringing masks back and how, oh my gosh, hospitalizations are increasing, but they're not increasing for patients that are infected with COVID. They're increasing for patients that have the common flu. And so there's this phenomenon known as viral interference that we're going to talk more about. And I think this is good news. And it turns out that when a pathogen is more infectious, more transmissible, it's going to survive and outcompete ecological niches in its environment. You can think about lions versus gerbils, or rabbits, right? You can think that the more dominant species or strain is going to survive in the ecosystem. Now, of course, there are situations where people are getting co-infected with both influenza and SARS-CoV-2. Right? I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but what we saw over the past several years is influenza essentially disappeared. Now, if you're like me, you might have wondered, why did that happen? Why did the flu seemingly disappear? Well, it turns out that SARS-CoV-2, those variants back then, were much more sort of lethal, infectious, and also virulent. So it outcompeted the ecological niche, preventing people from getting influenza. And that's why influenza cases during the year of 2020 and 2021 really almost virtually disappeared. And now they're back with a vengeance. Now, for all the people who are very scared of long COVID and all the complications linked with COVID and think that SARS-CoV-2 is the most deadly virus to ever exist on planet Earth, this should be welcomed news. We should be excited that, hey, the flu is back. This is something we know how to treat. We know the infectious fatality rate. We shouldn't be too worried about that. There's annual flu shots. If you decide you want to get one, knock yourself out. But what's interesting now is policymakers are not actually listening to the doctors in the trenches. They are seeing hospitalizations for respiratory-like illness, and they're thinking that is from SARS-CoV-2 when it's in fact from RSV or influenza. And so I think it's important that we understand this pathogen or viral interference effect. It's really quite fascinating. And it really kind of speaks to ecological niches. And it turns out that, let's say you get exposed to both SARS-CoV-2 and influenza in the same setting. Well, because influenza is now a little bit more virulent than COVID, because it's essentially lost its virulence as it's increased its transmissibility. Again, this was a thing that we talked about, a paradigm shift that we shared on this platform. In July of 2021, we got censored on Instagram. We got fact-checked for talking about this. I guess it was unpopular to mention that as pathogens increase their transmissibility, they tend to lose virulence as a cost associated with that increased transmissibility, which is a good thing. Viruses are trying to live, and if they can infect more people without killing them, they live longer. They want to live as well. They borrow your machinery, your proteins, your amino acids, your cellular machinery. And for whatever reason back then, people didn't want us talking about that. Now, it will be interesting to see how the media covers this, because up hitherto, I have not heard anyone outside of Michael Daniel. He's in Burbank, California, Santa Monica area, emergency room physician. We've had him on the podcast. Him and I have been going back and forth a lot and sharing some of these papers that I want to share with you, because this is a new phenomenon. Again, the pathogen or viral interference. And there's also bacterial viral interference. And there's certain situations where if you get infected with, say, pneumococcal bacteria, you might actually be more vulnerable to then also getting a co-infection with influenza. So it's not always that one negates the other. You know, these things are being sussed out in multiple studies. There was one study in 2019 that looked at this in great detail. I'll share it with you on the screen if you want to dive into that. That's been cited some 316 times. That paper was really interesting. And again, I think it sort of makes sense if you're looking at what has happened here in the US. If you look at the infectivity of COVID throughout the US and compare and contrast that and overlay that with influenza. There's not a lot of COVID positivity circulating, but the levels of tests that are coming back positive for influenza is north of 25%, which is astronomically higher compared to year over year. I'm talking about 2021 to 2022 and comparing 2020 to 2021. This, I think, is interesting, and it makes a lot of sense now that because Omicron is now so mild, it preferentially infects the upper respiratory airway, which again, we got a lot of flack for talking about how that's actually a good thing, right? If you're going to get a respiratory infection, you want it to be in the upper airway, not the lower, where you get a deep pneumonia and a lot of challenges with that. But I think it's good news. It's welcomed news. But as I mentioned, it will be very interesting to see if the media actually starts talking about this, or are they going to continue to talk about, well, hospitalizations are up, so we need to bring back mask mandates. And are we going to mandate people get the flu shot now? I mean, if COVID essentially is gone, right, and we're serious about hospital capacity, is that where this is going, where we have to mandate now flu shots in order to go to a restaurant? I certainly hope not, but it'll be quite interesting to see how this shifts as the ecological niches of the pathogens that are infecting people shift, how the media responds to this. I'm quite intrigued as to see how the response is. But let's dive into a few of these papers, friends. And before we continue on, I just want to thank you for being here. Thanks for hitting that like button. Thanks for sharing this video with a friend directly as a text message. That goes a long way. Also, if you want to promote health in your community, check out our sister company, myoscience.com. We have a bunch of great t-shirts. We have electrolytes. We have berberine fasting accelerator, a lot of great tools to help you become your primary healthcare provider. We know that health happens in your house with your habits, with your nutrition, with your feeding fasting windows, with your exercise. We're providing tools to help you get healthy. Because, as it turns out, there's a whole dossier of research showing that people who have poor metabolic health, people who are overweight and obese and have visceral adiposity and sleep apnea and prediabetes, guess what? They have more severe outcomes with influenza, with RSV, with other respiratory infections. We can no longer just continue to duck and hide from pathogens. They are ubiquitous. They're never going away. So your best defense is a good offense. So you can get healthy by going over to myoscience.com. Use the code podcast to save. That's podcast at myoscience.com. So let's dive into this paper here. Virus-virus interactions impact the population dynamics of influenza and the common cold. And there was another paper that directly looked at how influenza A competes with binding sites and outcompetes with SARS-CoV-2. So this is fascinating. But this particular paper, I just want to read to you one aspect of it. The significance of this paper is in this box right here. When multiple pathogens co-circulate, this can lead to competitive or cooperative forms of pathogen-pathogen interactions. It is believed that such interactions occur among cold and flu viruses, perhaps throughout broad-acting immunity, resulting in interlinked epidemiological patterns of infection. However, to date, quantitative evidence has been limited. We analyzed a large collection of diagnostic reports collected over the 11-year period and looking at multiple respiratory viruses. Our analysis provides strong statistical support for the existence of interactions among respiratory viruses. Using computer simulations, we found that very short-lived interferences may explain why common cold interactions are less frequent during flu seasons, during the winter, right? Some people still get a summer cold because influenza is not around. Improved understanding of how the epidemiology of viral infections is interlinked can help improve disease forecasting and evaluation of disease control interventions. I thought, to me, this stuff is just so fascinating. I mean, everything from the law of declining virulence to this now pathogen interference phenomenon. This stuff is very fascinating. And of course, we're not hearing about it on our legacy media, news outlets and so forth. But very interesting how when SARS-CoV-2 had a higher case fatality rate, influenza essentially disappeared. And now that the CFR is 0.02%, very low, lower than the flu, now the flu is back. So it seems that there is a competitive interaction here with the standard flu and SARS-CoV-2, which again should be welcome news for all of the people that have been fastidiously wearing their face masks and they are driving in their cars with hand sanitizer sprayed all over the place and Lysol and gloves. In fact, I was in LA not too long ago, about 10 days ago, and I saw a family, kid you not, literally, it looked like they had come right out of the Wuhan virology lab, okay? They had face shields, 2 N95 masks, and all of their luggage and stuff, and gloves, okay? Now, I didn't want to assume that they're fear-mongering, but no one else around them. Some people had N95 masks on and some cloth mask and, surgical mask, but it was a little overkill, at the rental car terminal there at LAX. And they just looked miserable. I mean, fogging up. There's fog all over their glasses and the face shield. And they were kids. I mean, it was just like, my friends, if you actually looked at the statistics, you were at increased risk for just catching the flu and getting sick from that compared to SARS-CoV-2. And I'm sure these people are vaccinated and presumably boosted at this point. And so we need to sort of tether back people from these extreme measures and, kind of guide them to focusing on the real thing, like stress reduction, improving sleep, walking 10,000 steps per day, because that improves immune health and increases testosterone, decreases blood sugar fluctuations. And so, and along those same lines on the airplanes, I know you've seen this as well, where you see people, they're on the airplane, they're getting on the airplane with their N95 masks, they have the hand sanitizer dangling off the backpack, and they are the first ones to order Sprite or Mountain Dew, and they think that they can, take the mask off and dangle it on their wrist as they're touching the drinks and then put it back on, as though that is actually doing anything. And so I really firmly believe that if you allocate all of your volitional resources to preventing exposure to any and all pathogens, it sort of robs from the willpower that you have to make healthy food choices. I know we haven't really talked about that before, but you only have so much willpower. Willpower is a finite resource. So if you invest all of your finite resources into sanitizing and distancing and masking and the whole thing, I strongly feel that you don't have sufficient bandwidth to then also make healthy choices because you're so focused on avoidance of an infection or a pathogen. Now, that hasn't been studied. This is just my hypothesis. But again, willpower is a finite resource and use it wisely. Focus on real foods. Focus on maintaining your microbiome and your virome. Remember, these pathogens are all over the place. If you're eating hyperpalatable processed foods, those cause dysbiosis. Those disrupt the virome and the microbiome in your lungs, in your airway, in your mouth. Doing simple things like mouth taping before bed can actually improve the oral ecology of your mouth. Floss your teeth. Sleep with your mouth closed and breathe through your nose while you're sleeping. That actually can improve the health of your mouth. And use a water pick with salt rinse. I mean, there's so many things that we should be doing to improve the health of our bodies, but yet we're not getting the messages. And that's why I continue to make these videos. And so the other paper here, titled Viral Interference Between Respiratory Viruses, speaks to the fact that when you get influenza infection, there's an increase in an antiviral protein called interferon, and that might help prevent SARS-CoV-2 infection. So again, I know no one really wants to get the flu. I think I might have just gotten it. Felt like I got it deep in my lungs, so it definitely wasn't Omicron. And I still worked out. I did all my routines and activities, but definitely felt a little congestion in my lower lungs, which was unpleasant. Okay, now some of you might say, well, so you're preaching health and you got sick. Yeah, once a year, most of us get sick. I mean, and it came during a time when I had a lot of travel and stress and stuff like that, so I pretty much brought it on to myself. However, it's important to remember that the flu might actually, by increasing interferon, might actually be preventing SARS-CoV-2. And because so many people are concerned about long COVID, how COVID impacts the olfactory bulb and parts of the brain, then we should welcome that the flu is back, that RSV is back. I know people are concerned about their children. A lot of children, I mean, if you look at the category of kids that have gained the most weight, out of all the different categories, 5 to 11-year-olds, their rates of obesity increased threefold during the course of the pandemic. So we know that, of course, excess adiposity and metabolic dysfunction is going to drive immune dysregulation. So it's important to recognize that we got to focus on the main thing, my friends. So what do you think about this pathogen interference phenomenon? Let me know in the comments below. I'll put links. I need to do a blog post and post all these articles. Really fascinating stuff. Again, I think we should welcome that the flu is back, and we should acknowledge that, hey, really COVID is now essentially has mutated itself into a very benign pathogen. It's not the big health concern anymore. Diabetes, obesity, hypertension, sleep apnea are the big health concerns now. Let's focus on those, my friends. Let's make people healthy again. Thanks for sharing this video. Thanks for leaving a comment. We'll catch you in a future one down the road. Bye now.